ji rola bencher songji rombare shu songji chödang tsoki choknam lo changchu baradu dagni jepsu chi daigi jinso jempe sunam ji rola bencher songji rombare shu songji chödang tsoki choknam la changchum baradu dagni japsu ji daigi jinso jembe sanam ji rola benchir robare shu simchen thamche dewa dang dewe judang denbara jurochi dungaran dang dungarai ji judang charwara jurochi Dungara mebe dewa damba tang min chala warai juruchi Nyering chadang tang chalwe tang nyum champo Neparai jurai chi barden tsawe lama rinpo Peme den jula kadrin chempe gone jisungde Kusum tuji ngodrom tsarandu sara Chumdende chambe yang la chatse lo Kongi lo drimni drendaran yetaran namda rapsara Chinye dungun jishin sikchiran yeki dunkaran ekbanzin Kanda sepe chunrara marig mentum dungare jesir Chozo gun la buching taratse yen la rokchu andensum Rogdara chenro nyun mo nilong leki jabro jerzeching Marig menzara dungare nyogu jingye choze rajinam Tene dakshin sachu tarasun yunden ruzoi jerse duweko Chuta chutan juni jentre daglul minsaran chambe yongla dum Tseden cheki chenrabe serangi Daglu dimug minpa rapsarane Kadang dinju shung lu dog bai Lo zhe bomben hawa tsaradu solam
He invited Khenpo Rinpoche for this. This first teaching that Khenpo Rinpoche gave us was intended to give us a solid foundation for progressing on the path. And was also intended to allow us to have an approach to visit Dhagpo. So then when we started repeating this teaching, Jigme Rinpoche explained that working on this teaching will allow us to clarify certain amalgamations that occur and will allow us to structure our our approach to the teachings. In 2006, when Khenpo Rinpoche gave this first teaching, he covered 3 themes. He covered a general presentation of Buddhism, which we focused on in December 2021. Then he shared an introduction to Buddhism, which we started in December of 2021 and then concluded in April 2022. And the third theme that he covered is that of the vehicles. This third theme, the vehicles, we started looking at it in December of 2022, and if all goes well, we will conclude it during this course. This third theme, the vehicles, is a presentation of the different vehicles, yanas in Sanskrit, that make up the different approaches of Buddhism. Khenpo Rinpoche started as an introduction to this third part by telling us that the teaching, the Buddha's teaching, is gathered into 4 schools of thought, or 4 types of established conclusions. On the one hand, that's concerning the philosophical view, and then on the other hand, into 5 vehicles concerning practice. These 5 vehicles are 2 worldly vehicles and 3 vehicles that lead beyond the world. Then Khenpo began by explaining to us very briefly what is a school of thought. It's not the theme of this particular part of the teaching. He simply shared that a school of thought, or an established conclusion, is that following analysis due to reasoning, we arrive at a conclusion. We establish a conclusion. This conclusion is established. We do not derogate. We don't go outside of the limits of this conclusion, this view. That's the principle of a school of thought. That's the first aspect. And then directly following this, Khenpo continued with the second aspect, the aspect of vehicles, which is more connected with practice. At this point, he started by sharing the definition of a vehicle. What is a vehicle? He said, in the context of practice, what allows us to go exactly to the fruit associated with a practice is a vehicle. What allows us to reach the fruit or result is what we call a vehicle. In Mipam Rinpoche's entry to the state of a Pandita, it is said that a vehicle principally refers to the paths. In the context of this teaching given by Khenpo, when we talk about a vehicle or a path, most of the time that refers to the same thing. Then Khenpo said to us that in the Buddhist context, there are 2 types of vehicles: worldly vehicles and vehicles that lead beyond the world. There are 2 worldly vehicles. He spoke about the vehicle of gods and humans. This vehicle is presented in 3 perspectives. We speak about the view of this vehicle. We speak about the conduct connected with this vehicle. And we speak about the familiarization connected with this vehicle. This is what we covered last December. Then Khenpo talked about the second worldly vehicle, the vehicle of Brahma, which is also covered in these three perspectives: conduct, view, and familiarization. That's a quick reminder concerning the two worldly vehicles. Then Khenpo talked to us about the vehicles that lead beyond the world. These vehicles that lead beyond the world are three in number: the Shravakayana, or the vehicle of the Shravakas, the Pacceka Buddhayana, or the vehicle of the Pacceka Buddhas, and the Mahayana, or the Great Vehicle. Last time we just started, Khenpo Rinpoche gave an introduction to these vehicles that lead beyond the world. And then he starts with the first of these three vehicles, the Shravakayana. We just started that last time in December. So I propose that we start again from the beginning, because it's really just a page, and it's a shame to jump in the middle without reviewing what we saw last time. So I propose that we start at the beginning of the Shravakayana. The first vehicle that leads beyond the world is the vehicle of the Shravaka. A practitioner of Shravaka affiliation is a person who is very sharply aware that samsara is nothing other than suffering. Khenpo Rinpoche gave us three characteristics of a being who has Shravaka affiliation, a practitioner of the Shravakayana. The first characteristic is that they have little desire. The second is that they have great contentment. And the third is that on the basis of understanding that the three realms are nothing but suffering, this practitioner does not want to remain in samsara a single second longer. They want to obtain liberation from samsara as quickly as possible. This is what Khenpo said to us as an introduction to this vehicle. Then he said, this vehicle of the Shravaka will be presented in 6 perspectives. There will be 6 points that explain this vehicle. The first point is the meaning or definition of the term Shravaka. The second point is the access to this path. What's the entry to this path, this vehicle? The third point covers the disciplines associated with this vehicle or path. The fourth point, the view associated with this path. The fifth point, the fruit actualized by this path. And the sixth point, the different categories within this path. So the first point, the meaning of the word Shravaka. The Sanskrit term Shravaka was translated in Tibetan by the term, 2 syllables, Nyen Tu. Nyen in Tibetan means listening, to listen to the words of the Buddha, listening to them in an appropriate manner. In other words, listening to them attentively in order to truly understand knowledge. Then tu here means that once we have listened to, once we have heard Buddha Shakyamuni's words, then we will put them into practice in order to progress on the path. Khenpo clarified that, in general, this term, Shravaka, can designate any student, any disciple of the Buddha, regardless of the school that they belong to. A bodhisattva is also someone who listens to the Buddha's words and then puts them into practice. A bodhisattva, who is meant to be a practitioner of the vehicle of the Mahayana, can also be called Shravaka in this sense. But more specifically, this term, Shravaka, refers to practitioners of the first vehicle, those who belong to the Shravakayana. The second point, access to this path, the access to the Shravakayana. The entry to this path occurs via the explanation of the 4 truths of the Noble Ones. This teaching, the 4 truths of the Noble Ones, is the first teaching that the Buddha gave. And the first time that he gave it, he taught in Sarnath, a small village next to Varanasi. He taught to 5 individuals who became his first 5 disciples. This teaching of the 4 truths of the Noble Ones is the teaching that makes up what we call the first turning of the wheel of the Buddha's Dharma, of his teaching. What are the 4 truths of the Noble Ones? The truth of suffering is the first one. This is what must be recognized, known or recognized. Then, the truth of the origin of suffering, what must be abandoned. The truth of cessation, what it is necessary to actualize. And fourth, the truth of the path, what a practitioner relies on to actualize cessation, or the fruit, the result. These are the 4 truths of the Noble Ones. Why the Noble Ones, or noble beings? These are 4 truths that are truly known by noble beings. They are truth only in the eyes of noble beings. Of course, as an ordinary being, we can also realize them. These 4 truths can also become truth in our eyes if we carry out efforts on the path. That's what Khenpo tells us. That's where we left off in December. We'll start by looking at the truth of suffering, the first of the 4 truths of the Noble Ones. What Khenpo explained when he talked about the truth of suffering is that first, when the Buddha taught the Four Truths, there were not only these first 5 disciples who are present, there were also 80,000 gods who listened to this teaching. The first words that the Buddha pronounced were these: monks, know that there is nothing else to recognize other than the truth of suffering. This sentence means that a samsara, in other words, an impure world system made up of the 3 realms of desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm, is nothing but suffering. The Buddha explained that whatever one's form of existence, be it divine, human, animal, etc., and regardless of one might find in these domains, mountains, countries, rivers, all of this is nothing but suffering. The Buddha said that the truth of suffering is known by noble beings, as Julie just said. Because noble beings know that samsara and these 3 realms are nothing but suffering, then they no longer experience any desire for happiness of the 3 realms. What are the reasons why it is said that the 3 realms are nothing but suffering? What are the aspects of this suffering? The Buddha explained this in detail. It's not enough to just remain with a statement. This statement needs to be explained and proved. The Buddha explained this in detail. What did he say? He said that places of birth, as well as births in the 3 realms, are nothing but suffering. So now we'll see the 3 realms and the various types of suffering present in these realms, starting with the desire realm. First, the desire realm as a place. It is made up of 5 destinations or destinies. The hellish destination, the place, then the hungry spirits, then animals, then destination of human beings, then the destination of gods of the desire realm. Don't we usually talk about 6? Yes, indeed. The destination of the gods can be split into 2. The destination of the asuras, demigods, and the destination of gods. Depends on the classification. These 5 destinations appear due to the power of the karma of beings who inhabit these various experiences of existence. Like any samsaric existence, these places inhabited by beings are subject to destruction. At the end of every kalpa, the various worlds are disintegrated by destructive forces of fire, water, wind, etc. First, there is the appearance of a world, and then, at a certain point, its disappearance occurs. While the world remains, there is also this perspective of subtle impermanence. Subtle impermanence is the fact that this world changes constantly in every moment. An external world, an outer world, is not a sentient being. It won't experience suffering. But this world is inhabited by sentient beings who, they themselves, suffer due to the fact that the world in question is impermanent by nature. This world is a source of suffering. This is why Shakyamuni Buddha said that the world is nothing but suffering. It's not because the world suffers, it's because those who inhabit this world suffer due to the fact that this world is impermanent by nature. This is something that we can observe when we see the different types of suffering that can be experienced due to changes of the outer world, such as natural disasters, etc. We're still looking at the desire realm. We looked at the place itself, and now we'll go into the beings that inhabit the desire realm. So, beings that inhabit this outer world, they experience only suffering. The outer world itself is only suffering because it is a source of suffering, and sentient beings themselves, we say that these births themselves are nothing but suffering. Why is this? Because these beings experience nothing other than suffering. There are, however, a great number of different kinds of suffering. All of these different sufferings can be categorized into three kinds of suffering. We speak about the suffering of suffering, which is an obvious suffering. Then we speak about the suffering of change, which is less obvious. And then we talk about the suffering of conditioning, which is quite a bit less obvious. The suffering of suffering. Let's start with this one. Khenpo told us that in the three lower destinations, hellish existences, that of pretas and that of animals, we can find these three types of suffering. However, the first type of suffering is predominant. Buddhist texts explain that, for example, the beings that people the hellish realms are constantly experiencing extreme temperatures, either extreme heat or extreme cold. which are unbearable experiences for a sentient being. As a human being, we don't have the capacity, the ability to directly perceive these existences. We also can't directly experience perceive the experience of the Predas, but we can connect with them because we can directly perceive the experiences of animals and the suffering that animals experience. Khenpo gave the example of a wild animal that lives in the forest. An example that's fairly fitting for our region. He said that a wild animal that lives in the forest, even when it's just chomping on grass, it's always looking all around because it's afraid of being attacked. An animal, wild or not, has little or no moments of peace, always tormented. But for myself, I can say that when I'm eating breakfast, chewing on my food, I'm not looking around wondering if I'm going to be attacked. We don't really experience this type of suffering. That's a brief presentation, we can say, of the first type of suffering. There are much more extensive presentations in the entry to the state of a Bandita, in the Ornament of Precious Liberation, for example. Then the second type of suffering, the suffering of change. Suffering of change is the primary type of suffering that we experience as human beings, and the same is true for divine beings. This type of suffering is associated with pleasant circumstances. The difficulty is that these pleasant circumstances change. They are impermanent. At a certain point, they disappear. And then we really experience suffering. Khenpo gave several examples. He said that most beings who attain a high position in their professional career, for example, they're always afraid of losing this position. This occurs because people experience their position as being pleasant, desirable, and if they lose their position, they'll experience suffering. Khenpo also spoke to us about people who have a lot of money, who are very wealthy. Wealth is perceived as something fairly pleasant. If we have a good financial situation, then most of the time we're also afraid of losing it. And Khenpo said to us that the same is true for fame, celebrity. All these things are relatively pleasant and we're afraid of losing them. Because we're afraid of losing all these things, everything that we have, we carry out all kind of non-beneficial actions, often harmful actions. Khenpo gave us a historical example, the example of one of the heads of the Sakya clan, the nephew of Shakyamuni Buddha. His name was Songden. Songden one day renounced his kingdom and became a Buddhist monk. After having taken monk's vows, he lived a very simple life. He sat or slept on kind of straw. He ate very simple food. He wore very simple robes. And he always said that he had a very pleasant life, that he was very content with what he had. He clearly saw that before, when he was still the head of the Sakya clan, he had very elevated standard of living. He had servants, he ate well. However, despite all that, he was constantly suffering from the fear of losing these conditions, fear of losing his kingdom, fear of losing servants, etc. And this is in fact why he renounced his kingdom, because he was aware that the life of a monk was in fact a source of happiness, because there was nothing to lose as a monk. Didn't have much, so didn't have much to lose. And as such, he was content with what he had. He was happy, and all the worries that he had as a prince were left behind. Khenpo explained to us, as a conclusion to this little story, that the lifestyle of an authentic Buddhist, which involves being content with just the essential, is a source of happiness, even if, from a worldly point of view, being content with just the essentials may not be enough. But if we really follow this reflection to its conclusion, we'll see that what's said here is quite obvious. In the world of humans, as that of gods, the primary suffering experienced is the suffering of change. This brings us to the suffering of conditioning. The first two types of suffering of suffering and the suffering of change, are perceptible to sentient beings of the various levels of the desire realm. Concerning the suffering of conditioning, this suffering is beyond what we ourselves, as beings of the desire realm, can experience. Can perceive. We don't perceive that the fact of being alive is suffering in and of itself. We don't perceive that from the moment of birth, existing is suffering due to change that occurs in every moment. We have no control over impermanence. We think that we're free to do what we want, but this is an error. We have no freedom due to impermanence. The thing that we wish for the least and that will happen to us is death. There's nothing we can do. We can't stop death. We have no control over it. The same is true for illness. No one wants to be sick. But it's something that happens at certain points in our life, nevertheless, and we have no control over these illnesses that appear. Furthermore, no one wants to get old, and yet this is what is happening to us in every moment of our life. The suffering of conditioning is this: having no independence, no control concerning impermanence. This concludes the explanations of the truth of suffering in the desire realm. Next up is the form realm. The form realm concerns the states or places of the dhyanas, or meditative concentrations. In these 4 levels, 4 dhyanas, or 4 meditative concentrations, there is a certain level of physical form. That's why it's called the form realm. What occurs in the form realm is that due to the power of samadhi, birth in one of the 4 levels of the form realm occurs based on appearance, spontaneous appearance. There's no gestation in a mother's womb. This birth occurs via apparition, appearance. At the same time that one appears in one of these levels, a palace also appears. This birth is what we can call, what can be called a miraculous birth. Khenpo explained that in the form realm, suffering of suffering and the suffering of change are not experienced. This doesn't mean that the individuals who inhabit these various levels of the form realm are beyond these types of suffering. In fact, in the minds of these individuals, the latent imprints of these 2 types of suffering are still present. Simply, when they are in the form realm, these 2 types of suffering cease. But then, when they will leave the form realm, these 2 types of suffering will reappear. Individuals of the form realm do not perceive the suffering of suffering or the suffering of change. However, they perceive the suffering of conditioning that we, human beings, do not perceive. Why do they perceive this suffering of conditioning and we don't? Because their perceptions are subtler than ours. Concerning the destruction of these levels of the form realm, Khenpo explained that the containing worlds of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd levels are subject to destruction by fire, water, and wind at the end of a kalpa. The 4th level, the 4th dhyana, is not subject to destruction in the same way. What happens in terms of the 4th dhyana is that when the ability for samadhi of an individual is exhausted, then the individual and all that surrounds them disappears. The 4th dhyana is not destroyed by fire, water, or wind. When the ability for samadhi of an individual is exhausted, then the individual and all that surrounds them disappears. This brings us to the third realm, the formless realm. This term, formless, does not mean that there is no physical form. This term indicates that there is no coarse forms. So it's more appropriate to say the realm without coarse forms. In fact, there are latent imprints associated with subtle forms. Concerning the definitions of these subtle forms, there are different points of view. Khenpo explained the point of view that we find in the commentaries of the Abhidharma, notably the commentary of the 8th Karmapa, Nikkei-dorje. In this commentary, it is said, what is called subtle form refers to the very subtle apparent forms produced by the movement of lung in Tibetan or vayu in Sanskrit. We're not going into explanations of lung and vayu here because I don't master that subject at all and we didn't receive them either. Khenpo didn't talk about that here, in fact. So we won't be able to answer questions on that subject either. Sorry, we won't be able to talk to you about that. Lung. The word is lung. Comments from the peanut gallery, but we don't know what they are. What we said is that we don't really have any answers about that. We didn't receive anything on that. Sorry. We can't reply. If you're going to ask questions, you need a microphone. Here's what we're going to do. Keep your questions for the end. Otherwise, we'll never conclude what we're saying. And furthermore, we didn't get any further explanations on that, so we won't be able to say anything else. So, individuals who inhabit the formless realm perceive subtle forms due to latent imprints in their minds. And Khenpo said, we won't go into more detail on this subject. To conclude the truth of suffering, so we've reached the end of the first truth of the Noble Ones. Khenpo said to us, a Shravaka, because we're in the explanations of the first vehicle, the Shravakayana, a Shravaka is a direct disciple of the words and possibly the body and mind of Buddha Shakyamuni. A Shravaka is an individual who listens attentively to explanations given on the Four Truths of the Noble Ones until they know them, they have truly assimilated them. Then they reflect on what they have heard, and therefore, as such, they realize that there is indeed nothing but suffering, in samsara. And the effect that this has is that they will be completely disillusioned with the world, with samsara. And so they will practice right up through liberation. The knowledge of a Shravaka, of the fact that there is nothing but suffering, is so clear, so sharp, that a Shravaka has no other thought than the thought of attaining liberation. They are completely focused on that. This knowledge of suffering, of the truth of suffering, is so profound that there is nothing that could persuade them to engage in actions that are not connected with the practice of the path. Actions said to be worldly. So that's it for the first truth, the truth of suffering. We'll begin the explanations of the second truth, the truth of the origin of suffering. When the Buddha explained the first truth to his first 5 disciples and the 80,000 gods who were around, these disciples, after having listened to his words and understood them, they asked the Buddha if there was a way to abandon suffering, if they could liberate themselves from the suffering. That's when the Buddha said this second sentence. The truth of the origin of suffering constitutes what is to be abandoned. The Buddha explained that there is nothing else to abandon besides the truth of the origin of suffering. So the monks asked him, what is the origin of suffering? The Buddha replied, the truth of the origin of suffering, thus the origin of suffering, is twofold. The first aspect is what we call actions, or karma in Sanskrit. Actions are, therefore, an origin of suffering. The second part is what we call afflictive obscurations. Afflictive obscurations are also an origin of suffering. Khenpo talked to us about actions, afflictive obscurations, and then he kept going by saying the origin or the root of afflictive obscurations, in other words, the origin of suffering, is mental fabrication, the mental fabrication that is belief in identity, or the view of a self. This mental fabrication, which is the view of a self, the view of an identity, is the origin or the root of all afflictive obscurations, which are themselves an origin of suffering, part of the origin of suffering. Then we might ask ourselves, how does this mental fabrication or conception that is belief in an identity come about? How does the view of self come about? How does this happen? Khenpo gave us two answers. One on a coarser perspective, and one based on a subtler perspective. In the coarser view or perspective the view of a self occurs based on the 5 aggregates. This conception, this view of a self, this belief in an identity will take the 5 aggregates as a support and will say, this is me. My 5 aggregates are me. And on the basis of this coarse grasping, there's a subtler perspective of this notion, of this conception, that then focuses on the mind stream itself, the mind's continuity. And it will consider this to be me. In this second, more subtle perspective, the first 4 aggregates, the aggregate of forms, the aggregate of sensations, the aggregate of distinctions, and the aggregate of conditioning phenomena, are seen as belonging to me, as being mine. And the 5th aggregate, the aggregate of consciousnesses, which primarily consists in the fundamental mind stream, this aggregate of consciousness will be seen or viewed as me. The 4 other aggregates are mine, and the aggregate of consciousnesses is me. On the basis of this error concerning the way of seeing phenomena, then in our mind, mental events appear in the mind, mental events that are afflictive obscurations. On the basis of this belief in an identity, then afflictive obscurations arise. Then Khenpo said, it's very important to be able to distinguish between mind and mental events. Olivier, what are the characteristics of mind? Let's take a short break to rest. As Julie just said, Khenpo told us that it's very important to distinguish between mind and mental events. What are the characteristics of mind, to begin? Khenpo cited the Indian Buddhist master Dharmakirti, who said the following concerning mind. The characteristic of mind is to know. That which is clear and knowing, or animate and knowing, is known as mind. When we say that which is animate and knowing, this concerns the two characteristics of mind. Knowing, Rikpa in Tibetan, means that mind can know the generality of the object, an overview. And animate, or clear, which translates the term selwa in Tibetan, refers to the fact that this continuity of knowledge is uninterrupted. No one can interrupt this continuity of consciousness. Then Khenpo explained what a mental event is. He said that a mental event is the distinct grasping of a particularity of an object. Mental events focus on a particularity of an object while excluding all other perspectives of the object. The Indian Buddhist master Vasubandhu said on this subject, that which knows the generality of the object is mind. That which grasps the particularities of the object are mental events. That which knows the generality of the object is mind. That which grasps the particularities of the object is the mental events. There's some grammar work to be done on this sentence in English, but you get the idea. Mental events function in the following way. For example, when we see a beautiful mug and we say, oh, I really need this mug, mental events present to the mind at this moment exclude every phenomenon which is not this mug. We don't think of anything other than the mug at this moment. Teacup. I sort of think about a teacup. It's necessary to know that there are many mental events. There are 10 mental events that constantly accompany samsaric mind. They're called the great basis of mind. These 10 mental events are necessary for mind to be able to focus on something particular. Then there are the 26 non-virtuous mental events, the 6 root afflictive obscurations, and the 20 related afflictive obscurations. Then there are 11 virtuous mental events, and the 4 variable mental events. They're said to be variable because, depending on the circumstances, they can be virtuous or non-virtuous. Concerning afflictive obscurations, it's necessary to know that root afflictive obscurations have their own nature or substance, and related afflictive obscurations do not have their own nature. They have the same substance as the root afflictive obscurations. They're sort of declinations of root ones. Khenpo described these 6 root afflictive obscurations to begin with. The first root afflictive obscuration is ignorance. He said that ignorance consists in not knowing what it is necessary to adopt or abandon. We can also share the definition that's given in the entry to the state of a pandita for those who study it. It can be a little reminder for those who study that text, and for those who haven't yet studied this text, might be a first introduction. The entry to this path of a pandita, I never remember what title we're using these days. The first of the 6 root afflictive obscurations is ignorance. It is not knowing the motive being of actions and their effects, the truths, and the 3 jewels. It makes all that is completely afflicted appear. Next is desire attachment. Desire attachment is being attached to aggregates associated with factors for descent of the 3 realms. This is, as it was explained in the entry to the state of a pandita, it brings about suffering of existence. It is also stated that it is of 2 types. Desire attachment of the desire realm, called desire attachment for desirable objects, and desire attachment of the 2 higher realms, called desire attachment for existence. Then comes anger. In the entry to state of a pandita, anger is profound hostility toward sentient beings, suffering, and supports for suffering. It prevents us from remaining in contact with happiness and is the support for harmful conduct. The fourth root afflictive obscuration is pride. The entry to the state of a pandita says, pride is that mind on the basis of the view of a whole I forget, there was a really good translation I came up with for this. Anyway, a whole in decomposition is imbued with superiority. It is the support for the absence of respect for others and the appearance of suffering. It is divided into 7. The fifth root afflictive obscuration is doubt. Entry to the state of a pandita says, doubt is being split concerning the meaning of the truths. It leads to not engaging in the direction of virtue. The sixth is the views. The root text of the entry to the state of a pandita says, views are all views marked by afflictive obscurations. They are the support for all harmful views. These views are categorized into 5. The first view is the view of, here it is, the view of a destructing whole. The definition found in the entry to the state of a pandita is the view of a destructing whole considers the 5 aggregates deeply grasped as being self and belonging to oneself. It is the support for the other views. The second view is the view that grasps extremes. The entry to the state of a pandita says, view that grasps extremes is self-grasping or grasping of the 5 aggregates as being permanent or interrupted. It is an obstacle to definitive emancipation by the middle way. Here, Khenpo gave us a short explanation. He said that this concerns the conception that there is a self or an identity that is either permanent or interrupted. In the first case, if we believe in a permanent identity or permanent self, then we're in the extreme of eternalism. Khenpo said that on the basis of this eternalist view, then on the basis of this eternalist view, religions that believe in a permanent God appeared. The second aspect, the second extreme of this view, is the extreme of believing that the 5 aggregates or the self are interrupted after death. In other words, believing that there's nothing after death. This is what is called annihilationism. We're still working on finding a term that corresponds better with the definition, but it's not very easy. The third view is false view. The entry to the state of Apandita says, false view considers the reality of actions, causes, and effects. He said that this false view makes us believe that the law of cause and effect, the three jewels, and the four truths of the noble ones are non-existent. Then we have the fourth view, the view that grasps a view as supreme. Entry to the state of Apandita says, a view that grasps a view as supreme considers the three previous harmful views as supreme and authentic, as well as the foundation of these views, in other words, the five aggregates, deeply grasped. It leads to strong fixation on harmful views. Khenpo simply explained that this concerns a view of mind, of course, that will grasp or believe that its view is supreme. This concerns thinking that there is no better view, no better established conclusion than our own. The fifth and final view is a view that grasps an observance and an asceticism as supreme. In the entry to the state of Apandita, it is said, view that grasps an observance and an asceticism as supreme considers an observance, an asceticism, and their foundations, the five aggregates, that do not purify nor liberate, as being that which purifies, liberates, and definitively emancipates. It leads to fruitless hardship. There are two perspectives here. A view that grasps that strict observance leads to liberation. An example of this is the Jain view that focuses on giving up non-virtue in an extreme way, with the view that this observance leads to liberation. For example, in this tradition, a practitioner doesn't drink water from a river without asking permission from the owner of the river, because if they don't ask permission, this is considered theft. According to Buddhism, this is a system that focuses on abandoning non-virtue in an extreme way. And this observance doesn't lead to liberation, according to Buddhism. The second perspective, or second aspect, is a view that grasps asceticism as supreme. This is believing that pain allows one to obtain liberation. For example, certain Hindu practitioners will sit close to a fire under a burning sun, with the thought that this excessive pain will allow them to purify what is preventing them from attaining liberation from samsara. We have covered the 6 root afflictive obscurations and the details of the 6th one with the 5 views. I propose that we stop here, and tomorrow we'll cover the 20 related afflictive obscurations. We won't go into them in detail. If there's a couple questions. And not about lungs, if possible. No, it's a detail. You said that during the first turning, you said there were the 5 first disciples of the Buddha, and then also the 80,000 gods. Were there other people? Or just the 5? We understood there were just these 5. There's an expression that you use often, which says knowing the mode of being of the truths. In terms of ignorance, you mentioned that Khenpo had commented that ignorance is not knowing the mode of being of the truth. I have a hard time with his expression, the mode of being of the truth. Can you explain it to me? Khenpo didn't say it. It's just in the definition that's in the entry to the state of a Pandita. This definition was explained in the explanations, the presentation of the aggregates on the basis of this text. From memory, what I would say is that when in the definition it speaks about the mode of being of actions and their effects, the truths and the 3 jewels, or more precisely concerning the truths, the mode of being of the truths is knowing, truly knowing that all that is explained in the truth of suffering is truly suffering, that all that is explained in the truth of the origin is truly the origin. So there's this aspect, and then I think there's a slightly more precise aspect that I think might have been explained in the truth of the origin. No, it's in the truth of the path. Each of the truths has 4 aspects or 4 characteristics. For example, from memory, the first truth of the Noble One, the truth of suffering, has 4 characteristics. It is suffering, it is impermanence, it is devoid of an identity, and it is emptiness. These 4 characteristics are what the truth of suffering truly is. So I think when it concerns the mode of being of the truth, it's connected with this. So it's knowing what is included in all of the explanations of the truths, and also knowing these 4 characteristics. But I don't have anything specific that backs up this understanding. So we can talk about it in the next presentation on the entry to the path of Pandita. Hello. I was wondering about the methods of investigation. How did they structure this? Is it just that is this from the Buddha, or were there great masters that illuminated certain things? I mean, concerning the contacts with the gods, etc. How did they understand all of this and structure it? This comes from 600 years before Jesus Christ. It's not that old. I was curious about the context. Khenpo didn't say anything about that. I'll just tell you what comes up for me. It's just a brief glimpse. What I've understood. The Buddha explained all of this, everything that's presented in all of these subjects, all of the subjects that are covered in Buddhism. The Buddha spoke about them first, and then masters over the centuries commented on the Buddhist teachings, gave commentary on the Buddhist teachings in order to, in a certain way, make them more accessible, allow them to be understood better by their contemporaries. Today, it's fairly difficult to understand the Buddha's words as they were given. It's very succinct. So masters who have already attained a certain accomplishment in terms of their scholarship, but also their meditation, wrote commentaries that are authoritative. And in this way, there was a certain structuring of the teachings in relation with these commentaries. I mean, the Buddha gave a certain structure, but he didn't say, okay, now I'm starting the next part on this subject. The contemporary structure mostly comes from the commentaries from the masters. Julie adds, well, there was a first level of structure that was put in place by the Arhats that gathered in the first council to gather all of the words of the Buddhas. They gathered them into 3 categories. These are teachings focused on phenomenology, these are teachings that focus on conduct, and these are teachings that focus on meditation. So that was sort of the first level of structure, and then the structure continued in the way that Olivier described it. That's what I understood. And Khenpo, when he gave this teaching, he used a commentary written by the master Jamgon Kundreul Ling, and he followed the structure that Jamgon Kundreul Ling used when explaining these different subjects. We're going to conclude here today. Everything continues pretty quickly in the program, so we'll conclude here. There'll be more chances for questions. Let's dedicate.